Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And I'd like to talk about an article that explores a predisposition that I think we all have. And frankly, it's one of the things that was likely a massive advantage in early Homo sapien evolution that's turned into a substantial vulnerability, from what I can tell, in-group bias. Thank you very much, Gemma. I appreciate the award. Welcome, welcome. And so this is one of those concepts that's sort of intuitive, right? But also pretty complicated and has a pretty substantial history behind it. And but at its simplest level, it's this tendency that we all seem to have where we tend to favor the well-being of individuals to whom we are close over those to whom we are not. Hey, Scott, thanks for joining here. Appreciate it, man. Hope all is well. So that sounds pretty simple, right? And there are some fairly simple explanations for why it is that we tend to care about some humans more than others. There's a fairly famous quote from the biologist J.B.S. Haldane, whom you can see here, which goes something like this, quote, "I will gladly sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins," end quote. The concept being that the more genes you share with someone, the more likely to instinctively care about their well-being you are. And so to be totally clear, it's really just a mathematical statement that he's making. And so if you save the lives of 2 siblings who share approximately half of your genetic information, then you've saved the equivalent of all of your genes, right? With 2 siblings being saved, and by giving your life to save both of them. And then same, similar concept with the 8 cousins. Each has about 12.5% of your genetic material. And so saving 8 of those cousins would equate to all of you. And so this is obviously an oversimplification. That's really not how genes work when it comes to siblings, reproduction, and so on. It's not perfectly mathematical that way. It's messy, as biology always is. But it conveys the fundamental point, right? That the genes that we all share seem to play a role in how much we'll tend to preoccupy ourselves with each other's well-being. And so J.B.S. Haldane is an interesting character in the history of science, an example of when science and politics can collide. But irrespective of all that, the fundamental point he made is useful, right? There does seem to be a reason that you're likely to care more about the well-being of your brother, your sister, your mother, father than your unrelated neighbor. However, in-group isn't limited to people who are most closely genetically related to you, though that's absolutely a major source of those in-group affiliations. But even beyond simple genetics, there are other factors that can make you feel instinctively driven to sympathize or empathize with someone you've never met over someone else you've never met, right? And so, for example, you might be more likely to care about your next door neighbor than someone who lives 30 miles away. And then even then, you might be predisposed to caring about that person, 30 miles away than someone who lives like 300 miles away. And to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, 300 miles is almost precisely the distance between Philadelphia and Boston, which, to people outside of the United States probably sounds like a meaningless difference, right? But these are 2 rather different cities in 2 rather different states, despite both playing a pretty significant role in American history. But while, both cities primarily speak the same language, theoretically, there are 2 pretty clearly different accents, the Boston versus the Philly accent. And the whole sports fandom situation is just bananas in both cities. Both are notorious when it comes to particularly their football fandoms. But in any case, it wouldn't be deranged, right, to suspect that 2 people in Philadelphia, as diverse a city as this is, that 2 people in the same city would tend to favor, each other over someone from Boston. Oh, sure. Well, I'm glad you're into it. You're interested. Hey, Daryl, my favorite neuroscientist and friend, of course. Oh, well, that feeling is reciprocal. You are part of my in-group, that's for sure, Daryl. Gemma says, I actually have some of my best friends thousands of miles away and get on more with them than I do people on my doorstep. That's right. Yeah, so you can form these in-group relationships beyond just, kinship. And so that's what we're talking about when it comes to, in-group versus out-group, this tendency to favor certain people over others contingent upon some kind of shared feature. And of course, cults are a particularly interesting manifestation of that tendency that we have being exploited to cultivate a kind of, hierarchy based on that drive that we all have to be a part of some kind of tribe, some in-group, to belonging, right? And so, and so David says accents in the UK can vary over very small distances. Yeah, the Pitmatic dialects used down the mines could vary over just a few miles. Accent. Yeah, accents. Funny enough, I actually read accents. Yeah, that is kind of wild to me, how like significantly different the accents can be in the United Kingdom. And it's like not a particularly giant area. And I suppose that's true in the United States too, although it's a much larger country, just in terms of space. But anyway, so at the most basic level, what we're talking about is this tendency towards pro-social behavior as opposed to antisocial. And we preferentially extend pro-social behavior to certain individuals within our groups over those of other groups, right? And you probably don't have to like strain your brain too much to think of categories that are used to define in-group versus out-group dynamics, right? Nationality, religion, race, but even things like fandoms, right? Musical genres, even exercise communities like the Peloton community. These are all, or CrossFit, right? These are all examples of these dynamics throughout our daily lives, right? All over the place. And one can be part of several in-groups. And so the issue is that this predisposition towards being, driven to join some kind of in-group seems to result in what's called an empathy gap when it comes to out-group members, right? And so in other words, we'll have a tendency to not only experience a heightened level of empathy extended towards members of our in-groups, but we'll also tend to extend the opposite towards out-group individuals, right? And so like pragmatically speaking, that manifests as a predisposition to pay a greater personal cost to intervene in the suffering or to stop the suffering of in-group members compared to out-group members. And so in other words, you're just literally willing to sacrifice more to prevent the people to whom you're closest from suffering or having negative experiences, right? And, intuitive as this all may be, it's a kind of interesting predisposition that we have as primates. And I use that term primates deliberately. So it turns out that we Homo sapiens aren't the only animals in town who exhibit this kind of in-group, out-group social predisposition. And so in fact, like pretty much any animal that you can think of does as well. And so for example, some of my favorite primates, chimpanzees and bonobos. The middle one is a bonobo, the one on the other end is a chimpanzee. But then also the noble mouse. We all have this tendency to, to extend extra empathy to certain members of our species over other members of our species, right? Of the same species. And so, just for example, just like us, rodents will experience stress and fear when they see other rodents having negative experiences. And they'll extend comforting behaviors towards rodents that have just undergone some kind of stressor. And they'll exhibit behaviors that are beneficial to other rodents beyond solely, considering their own personal benefit, right? And so these are pretty complex social interactions for a rodent, right? It can be tough for some humans to extend or to exhibit that kind of selfless behavior, right? And I'm obviously kind of kidding, but basically any species that exhibits social behavior at all will have these tendencies. We all share a common ancestor at a certain point, right? Okay. And so we all, tend to exhibit this predisposition. Chef Mario has arrived. Well, welcome, Chef Mario. So why do I pick and choose? Cher says, why do I pick and choose? Well, you can, right? It just depends on what in-group you're talking about. It's kind of tough to pick your family, right? Although I suppose you can, but generally speaking, there's a little bit less choice when it comes to those types of in-group relationships. But and so, hey, Asha, good to see you. You and the family well? Yeah, we're doing pretty good, pretty good. Daryl says ring-tailed lemurs actually form gangs. It's insane. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, essentially all primates do, right? I mean, like gangs, they form colonies or troops, right? But yeah, so we all, tend to exhibit this tendency, right? All these animals. But why does it happen, right? What part of our biology, what part of our brain drives us to exhibit this bias? Because that's really what it is. It's a bias. And so that's what this team set out to do. And so to figure out what part of the brain drives this predisposition. And so, by the way, astute neuroscience observers might recognize one or more of the names in this list of scientists, but likely would catch that Carl Dieseroth is included in the authors. And I have a funny little story involving Carl Dieseroth. So Carl Dieseroth was one of the two, essentially, main scientists who integrated a technique called optogenetics, which is a technique that I used in my research, into neuroscience. It's a revolutionary technique. And so I was at the Society for Neuroscience conference. This was in 2017 in Washington, D.C., and tens of thousands of scientists converge on a city like pirates and just sort of take it over for like a week, basically. And I mean, by pirates, I mean like after the conference associated activities afterwards at night, all the bars are full of rowdy, gregarious, boisterous neuroscientists, oftentimes arguing. I actually got into a sort of debate with a whole team from the Mayo Clinic in DC. It was a lot of fun. But anyway, so, I'm at this poster, I presented my poster. I go to this other poster who's not only using a lot of the same techniques that I use, but also studying the same circuit that I was studying. And, we were going through her data and what she found, and also talking about the types of things that don't end up on the poster, right? The mistakes, the attempts that were unsuccessful, that kind of thing. And so, we're going through it. And I noticed her eyes, her gaze are sort of like bouncing between me and like right behind me. And like, whatever, people are watching, people walk by and everything, but she kept doing it. And so I finally conclude our conversation and I turn around and Carl Dieseroth is like basically right behind me listening to our entire conversation. And I'm glad I didn't know he was there because he is one of the most successful and important scientists who are alive today. But anyways, pretty cool, right? So he's on this paper. And this is clearly a pretty widely distributed collaboration from Tel Aviv to Toronto to Stanford and Berkeley. So that's pretty cool. It's always fun to see those kind of giant collaborations. Thank you very much for the award, Chef Mario. I appreciate it. Jenna says, I wish we could pick and choose. Sometimes when we know someone is no good for us, we just can't let it go. Yeah, absolutely. Those in-group associations can be pretty strong. And so cute entitlement. I'm not sure what you mean by that, James. And so, okay, so then Daryl says, I sort of imagine these in-groups like overlapping umbrellas of various sizes. Yeah. I'm an Edmontonian. Is that how you say that? I'm an Albertan and I'm a Canadian, like more distinct identities. Yeah, totally. Right. I mean, and that's certainly true in the United States, right? People can be very, very strident in their association with being a Philadelphian, right? Or whatever, from a certain state or a certain city, but then, you're also part of this broader community, the country, right? Anyways, yeah, totally. I totally agree. Like almost concentric circles of in-groups or overlapping, like you're saying, like Venn diagrammy. But yeah, so, okay, so this group, this very distributed group globally, was working with rodents, okay, trying to figure out what's going on in the brain when a rodent intervenes to free a trapped in-group member versus a trapped out-group member, okay? And so the experiments revolve around something called the helping behavior test, which is exactly what it sounds like. Seeing when a rodent will release another rodent from some kind of restraint. And generally speaking, rats will tend to preferentially release members of their in-group while not really doing so for members of their out-group, right? And so as Inbel Ben Ami Bartal, apologies, I'm probably mispronouncing that name, but faculty at Tel Aviv University, as they say, quote, humans as well are biased towards helping other members of their social groups over individuals they view as outsiders. And this can have negative impact in diverse societies where different groups need to cooperate in order to thrive. And then later they say, quote, understanding the brain mechanisms underlying these biases is essential to finding ways to eliminate them. Okay, so that's what this group was doing. And that's also why they were working with rats, right? So given that they exhibit the same kind of predisposition towards helping in-group rats over out-group rats, we might be able to get a sense of what it is in our brains that causes us to do the same. And while their brains are obviously significantly smaller than the human brain, they have essentially all of the same anatomical structures that we have, just smaller and simpler. And just to cover our bases here, that's not an entirely uncontroversial statement to make, right? There are definitely some neuroscientists who would argue that rodents don't actually have something like a prefrontal cortex, just as one example. But when it comes to this study in the brain regions that they were focusing, that they honed in on, that is largely inconsequential. They do have the same brain regions, just smaller and simpler. And so Cher says, so we can't all just get along. Right, that's sort of what we're talking about here. And so, okay, so we're sort of like on this hunt for which parts of the brain drive that predisposition that we have. Like essentially all animals for treating certain other members of our species better than others, right, within that group. And so there's one thing that's pretty central to how they did their experiments, right? It is that helping behavior test. And so this is a behavioral test for rodents that's devised to try and explore this tendency that we have, right? To be driven to help others with no obvious concern for a payoff. And so it's sort of like, let's see, do I have, oh, shoot, I didn't, oh yeah, here it is. Boop. and we'll do this. And so this is from a pretty wild video from 2012 of like an entire group of dolphins, I guess an entire pod of dolphins that ended up getting like simultaneously beached, something like 30 dolphins getting beached at the same time. Totally bananas, but basically everybody on the beach sort of responded almost immediately and helped them get back into the water. It's sort of, one of those kind of just made for the internet moments, right? And I can share a link to that video if anybody wants to check it out. It is pretty strange. And you can hear their sort of dolphin sounds. It's wild. But anyways, yeah, I mean, it's not like a beach dolphin has really any impact on a human life, right? Just people were driven to help. And so it's sort of similar to that, sort of. But when it comes to this study, what we're really talking about are conspecific interventions, right? Which specifically refers to when an animal, including humans, intervenes on behalf of a member of its own species. And when it comes to this helping behavior test, rodents have been shown to help other rodents who are in a restrainer with no expectation of reward or even any familiarity with the restrained rodent. And so that's the way that they're exploring this whole tendency that we animals have, right? Now, there's potentially spicy interpretations of this study involving how it is that in-group and out-group were defined in this study. But at its simplest level, they were working with different strains of rats, okay, with different fur coloration. Yes, please share the link. Okay, here, I'll get it to you right now. And yeah, bam, bing, bong, boom, got it. Like the people that always help the baby sea turtles out to the ocean. Yeah, totally. Like, why do we do that, right? Despite the fact that, it really doesn't have any, at least immediate benefit. Yeah, it's an interesting behavioral tendency that we have. But, again, this study is focusing on conspecific helping behavior, right? So, if there was like a human that was just hatched out of an egg and needed to crawl to the ocean, obviously humans don't hatch from the eggs. We all know that, right? You have to crack the egg first, and then you can get the human. All right, anyway, so here's what they found. So first of all, rats, just like us, exhibit a bias towards helping their own in-group over out-groups, right? So no big shock there, but they confirmed that rodents share that predisposition that we have as well. And so they found that there were specific brain regions that corresponded to this predisposition, this helping predisposition. But some brain regions were only associated with the times that rats intervened on behalf of their own strain, their in-group, over the other strain, their out-group. And so in case you're interested, memorizing brain regions isn't usually particularly beneficial or edifying unless you're within the discipline. But, I know it can be. It was interesting to me before I joined the discipline. And so when it came to when rodents intervened, no matter what the strain was, right? In-group, out-group didn't matter. Whenever they intervened, they found activity in the orbital frontal, the anterior cingulate, and the insular cortices, right? So if a rat was helping their buddy out, irrespective of whether, they were the same strain, those brain regions exhibited increased activity. Okay, pretty cool. But the interesting aspect of this study is which brain regions were only active when the rats intervened only on behalf of members of their own strain, of their in-group. So, once again, it's not super critical to know precisely which brain regions were involved. But for those who are interested, they honed in on the medial orbital frontal cortex, the prelimbic cortex, the lateral septum, a brain region that I studied, and the nucleus accumbens as brain regions that were, I also studied the nucleus accumbens, that were especially associated with instances that the little, rodents intervened on behalf of members of their own group. Now, the lateral septum is an interesting brain region. It's one of those brain regions, it's towards the front of the brain. And it's one of those brain regions that's been studied for a very long time. And here's why. In some of the early studies, it turned out that when the lateral septum, this brain region, was lesioned or damaged, animals, including humans, would exhibit something called septal rage. They would become incredibly confrontational, aggressive, belligerent, and they're experiencing septal rage. So what do we learn from that? Perhaps the septum somehow regulates that kind of aggressive behavior. But anyways, and it turned out that this brain region was involved in helping in-group members of their own species versus out-group. But so in particular, the nucleus accumbens was central to when the rats intervened on behalf of in-group members. And so, and so anyone who does behavioral or addiction or mood-related research is very, very intimately familiar with the nucleus accumbens. And so it is a brain, it's part of your brain that's basically a sort of central dopamine depot, right? So do you see that part of that picture that says ventral tegmental area towards the bottom? That's where a whole ton of your brain's dopamine is created, is synthesized. And so the neurons in that part of the brain just crank out dopamine and send it to a few brain regions. But when it comes to the expectation that something good is about to happen, the expectation of reward, that specific connection between the ventral tegmental area, sometimes called the VTA, and the nucleus accumbens is like the main character, the central driving signal in the behaviors that are driven by the expectation of something good happening. This circuit doesn't only, sometimes the circuit is mischaracterized as being the sort of the reward circuit, and that's actually not quite true. It is involved in the expectation of reward, but really what it is salience. It's determining if something around you that's happening around you is relevant to you. And relevant by, meaning if something good might happen to you, if you exhibit some kind of behavior, or if something happens, you expect something good to happen to you. But what it's really for is learning. It's for error correction, right? So you do something that you expect to benefit, to yield some kind of benefit for you, and you get that benefit, that good outcome. Okay, great, you were right. But if you do something that you expect to generate, yield some kind of benefit, and there is no benefit after you do it, that feels bad, right? You're disappointed. It's like a negative emotional experience, and that negative emotional experience corresponds to a plummet, or the dopamine levels in this circuit plummeting, right? And so, and that's how you learn, right? You do something, you expect something good to happen, you keep doing it. But if you do something and nothing good happens or something bad happens, you stop doing it, right? That is like the fundamentals of how humans learn new things. And this dopamine circuit is central to that process. But the reason that anyone studying things like addiction or mood are intimately familiar with this pathway is that basically any drug that people consume voluntarily cranks up the activity in this neuronal pathway between the VTA, ventral tegmental area, and the nucleus accumbens. So cocaine, cannabis, amphetamine, and heroin, but also alcohol, nicotine, and even caffeine. They all influence activity in this pathway. And so that's part of the reason that understanding how it is that these substances influence the brain can be so helpful to understanding how it is that human consciousness works, right? These are substances that have zero nutritional value, right? They don't taste particularly good, but humans voluntarily consume them, and consume them oftentimes at dangerous or even fatal levels. And so Cosmic Rose says, I'm in Twitch now. The link was not visible on YouTube. Maybe it'll be visible in Twitch now. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. Let's see if I can do this fast. Here. Yeah, because I share it on Haps. That's why. Duh. Okay. Here, I will put it here. And you should be able to see it there. And then I will put the links in the YouTube description after we're done. Okay. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. And so then how do you explain first responders in that equation? They expect no reward. Well, they do get paid, right? It is their job. I mean, it is an interesting point that you make. And they do, get accolades for being first responders or for successfully responding first, right? I mean, so there is some benefit. But I totally agree with you that, like, it is a far more selfless vocation than the vast majority of jobs, certainly the vast majority of jobs, right? But I mean, there is some benefit. It would be, I think, very, very difficult to have a sufficient number of first responders if there was no payoff. There was no, compensation. There were no benefits, health insurance related benefits in the United States. But I mean, it is a fair point. And I mean, what you're bringing up is very interesting, because there is a spectrum regarding the degree to which somebody tends to be more empathetic or less empathetic. And, so we vary along those lines. And it could be that part of that variability is a byproduct of this network of brain regions that we're going to talk about in a second. But it's an interesting point. Yes, it worked. Thanks, virtual hug. Thank you. Okay. And so love, not live, or live. And so Daryl says the social benefit of saving human life is huge, regardless of financial reward. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you get credit, like social credit. Yeah. There's a certain degree of respect that I think people are afforded if they, work in as a first responder in some capacity. Yeah, I agree. But so the reason that part of the reason that understanding how it is that these substances influence the brain can be helpful to understanding how human consciousness work, right? Because they don't really have any nutritional value, but people consume a ton of them, and these substances directly influence the circuit on which this team of scientists converges, right? This nucleus accumbens, this ventral tegmental nucleus accumbens circuit. And so they found that when when the rats were approaching their little buddies, right, who were trapped, who were members of their in-group, right, activity in the nucleus accumbens, that part of the brain that receives those dopamine signals every time you take a sip of caffeine, or coffee or alcohol, whatever, but then also anytime you engage in something that you expect to yield some kind of benefit to you. That part of the brain, right, activity there was quite a bit higher, right, when a rat was approaching another rat who was a member of their in-group. So activity in that brain region was quite a bit higher compared to when they were approaching some other random rat, right, that had less in common with them, a different strain, and also quite a bit higher compared to when they'd come across just some random trap without any, other rat involved, just an empty trap. And so that's what you're seeing in this graph, right? The green line on the bottom is when a rat would approach an empty trap, right? So there's no social interaction, no in-group, out-group, nothing. The blue one is when they would approach, the higher you are on this graph, the more activity there is in the nucleus accumbens, in that brain region. The blue line in the middle is when a rat would approach some other rat that was not a member of their in-group, that wasn't of the same strain, had different fur coloration. And then the top red one, where you can see that spike, that's when a rat was approaching another rat who was trapped, who was a member of their in-group, right? And so this specific brain region seemed to become active when rats came across other rats with whom they shared some general features, right, members of the same strain. And so, by the way, they were working with an experimental method called fiber photometry, which was a technique that someone in the lab had just gotten off the ground. It's really neat. It basically enables you to essentially observe changes in the levels of activity in various regions of the brain. So pretty cool. They didn't, this wasn't the only experiment that they conducted. They didn't only have data that implicated the nucleus accumbens. They identified a whole networks of neurons, right, of brain regions that were associated with when rodents interacted with other members of their in-group versus members of their out-group. And that's what you're seeing in these two categories here. Be a Kind Human, I like that. That handle's very apropos. Says, why does a broken heart actually feel like a broken heart? It's an interesting, heartbreak. Well, it's very, very complicated. And I assume you're like literally saying, like, why is it that I feel like I can physically feel heartbreak or depression or anxiety, right? Heartbreak isn't necessarily entirely unique in that capacity, right? Severe anxiety can feel like pressure on the chest. We don't have a perfect answer for that. But the relationship between your interoception, I guess, or your bodily sensations and your emotional states or brain states, there's a very close relationship between the two. They're not completely distinct processes, right? Part of the entire reason that we have the ability to feel, to perceive, have sensory experiences with our body is to update the brain on the status of the body, because the brain depends pretty heavily on the status of the body, right? If your body's being damaged, that's relevant information for the brain, right? And what is the system that we use to signal that our body is experiencing damage? It's pain, or just unpleasant, with nociception, right? Unpleasant sensory experiences. And then what is the system that the brain uses to motivate us to engage in some kind of behavior to escape that damage? Emotion, right? It feels bad. It feels negative. If it felt good, then, you'd hold your hand on the stovetop until you really couldn't anymore, right? And so as a result, that relationship can be reciprocal. It's, back and forth. It's not just one way. And so if you are experiencing a severe emotional state like heartbreak or like severe anxiety or like depression, that can manifest psychosomatically, that can manifest as the same types of things that would cause you to feel those emotional experiences being generated by those emotional experiences, because, they are united, right? They evolved to be united. And so that is like one possible explanation. There are other explanations that neuroscientists would probably, people who are big fans of the vagal system, for example. But personally, as somebody who studied anxiety, I think that's really the explanation. It's a really interesting dynamic, though, right? It does sort of fly in the face of folks who argue that it would be just so wonderful if we didn't have emotional experiences to begin with, right? Emotion is like one of the most important components of our consciousness and very useful. It can also be a huge disadvantage, of course. But Okay, yeah. So this group didn't only have data that implicated the nucleus accumbens, right? They identified whole networks of brain regions that were associated with when rodents interacted with other members of their in-group versus members of their out-group. And so that's what you're looking at here, these two categories. And so, I know this is here, I can make it big for just a second in case anybody's really interested. Each one of those little nodes is a different brain region. And, the size is corresponded to how much activity there was when either intervening for an in-group versus an out-group. And you can see these are distinct brain regions, right? And so, yeah. Okay. And so yeah, and obviously they had to do other experiments beyond the single one that I showed you to identify all those different brain regions. But so it's sort of unsurprising, right? But also kind of provocative that this pathway would be involved in this kind of behavior. That the scientists proposed two interpretations for why the nucleus accumbens would be so centrally involved. First, that this constellation of brain regions is what underlies empathetic helping, right? The drive to relieve another individual of suffering. That is just inherently rewarding to intervene to help another. Right? As Daryl was saying, it feels good to help somebody. But then another interpretation is that the rats, and us by extension, will tend to intervene to help members of our in-group because we're driven to create new social contacts that redound to our benefit in some way. And so those are the two primary interpretations that they posit, right, that they put forth. And however, there are other potential interpretations of these experiments, right? It's not a perfect encapsulation of decision-making associated with in-group, out-group interactions. But these kinds of limitations are generally present in essentially all behavioral experiments. But like we can just brainstorm, like what's another potential explanation? And perhaps this is what they meant. This team of scientists meant by that first interpretation of their results, that the drive to relieve another individual's suffering is inherently rewarding. Another is that these brain regions are involved. They did pinpoint the insular cortex as involved in no matter when a rodent helping another rodent. There's insular activity in the insula, and so anybody who's familiar with the insular cortex, it does what it sounds like it does. Insular, right? It is sort of like one of the most central brain regions involved in disgust and displeasure and really disgust. And so it's active, for example, when, if you're sitting in a room and somebody hasn't taken out the trash for too long and you can smell the garbage in the room and you're just like, you just feel gross, it feels dirty, it smells bad, obviously. Activity in the insular cortex is part of why, you just want to escape. You want to deal with that problem. But it's also active when, you observe some other human being experiencing something very unpleasant, right? Being struck or being very, very hungry, right? Just suffering. Activity in the insular cortex is also associated with that. And it's kind of an interesting evolutionary story if you think about it, right? It means that this brain region that is present in rodents, present in some of the simplest organisms, that really likely evolved to help us to avoid potentially dangerous food, potentially rotting flesh, things that just smell bad. They smell bad because they're dangerous for us to consume. But that brain region that really evolved to motivate us to escape that or to avoid it, certainly not eat it, as time went on and as we became more and more social, was co-opted and now is involved in moral disgust, ethical disgust. So this brain region is involved no matter when a rodent was helping another rodent. In-group, out-group didn't matter. And so another interpretation is that this brain network that they identified, that were not necessarily motivated by a desire for reward by helping somebody else, but maybe the relief of displeasure, of our own personal displeasure. And so Sherry, when you bring up like, what about, first responders who have dedicated their lives to just helping other people? And yeah, I mean, I say that they receive compensation and stuff, but it's not that significant, right? They're not paid as much as their value to society would demand, right? It could very well be that they lived a life where in their past, they experienced some kind of trauma, right? And as a result, they are driven to prevent that trauma from occurring to other people. Right. And that's why it feels good, because they are, fundamentally confronting their own past life trauma by relieving the trauma of others. That's another potential explanation. Regardless, this does sort of put how we think about empathy and selfless behavior into some maybe a little bit more sort of comprehensive or vivid context. right? As the lead scientist says, quote, "This research shows that the reward system has an important function in helping behavior. And if we want to increase the likelihood of pro-social behavior, we must reinforce a sense of belonging more than a sense of empathy." End quote. So that's pretty cool, right? So, I think intuitively we would all assume that when helping somebody else, it is empathy that's driving that behavior, right? But what their results suggest is that actually it seems to be reward, or at least the expectation of reward. And that reward is tied to a sense of belonging to this member, to the same group that this member whom you're helping belongs, right? And so you only experience that significant reward signal when you're helping a member of your in-group, or at least that as these data would suggest. And so as a result, if you're trying to amplify pro-social behavior as opposed to antisocial behavior, violent behavior, and so on, cultivating a sense of belonging rather than just emphasizing that it is to be a good human is to be helpful, is to be empathetic, might be more effective, right? It might be more effective to just make everybody feel like they belong. And as a result, they'll just be more likely to exhibit those pro-social behaviors. It's an interesting interpretation. But okay, and then so James says, is the same functions that determine if you care for others, so do they explain why a person would not care for themselves? That's very interesting, Gentleman Ghost. Okay, or I suppose I can call you James. So is the same, or do the same functions that determine if you care for others, do they explain why a person would not care for themselves? There might be some overlaps in the neuronal, the anatomy underlying these behaviors, but I suspect that these are pretty distinct phenomena, behavioral phenomena. And I assume when you are referring to when somebody doesn't care for themselves, I assume what you mean is when people self-harm, or when they don't, behave in ways that are in their own best interests, right? When their diet is terrible, or when they, whatever, when they're just not taking good care of themselves. I suspect that would be best explained by something distinct, by something other than in-group, out-group dynamics. But a lot of the same emotional experiences would be involved in both. So low self-esteem issues, yeah, exactly, right? Or depression, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, just past life trauma, parental neglect, for example, or physical abuse, or these types of things. They're not inherent to this in-group, out-group dynamic that all animals exhibit, all social animals. But it is an interesting thought, and a lot, because emotional experiences drive both of these things. A lot, some of the same brain regions will be involved. I would imagine that the raphe nuclei would be involved in both. These are brain regions, basically in the brainstem, that here, I can actually show you if you're interested. So it's not listed on this this circuit. This is essentially just the dopaminergic circuit. But if you see where the ventral tegmental area is, if you just continue going down along the brainstem, you'll enter into the raphe nuclei, which is a collection of nuclei. A nucleus in neuroscience means two things, very frustratingly. A nucleus can be where all of your genetic material is in every cell in your body, but also in anatomy, a nucleus can be just a cluster of neurons that are sort of more similar to each other than other neurons. And so the raphe nuclei are brain regions that produce a huge amount of the brain's serotonin levels. And so I would imagine, for example, that in that instance, activity in the raphe nuclei would be involved in both, coming to the aid of an in-group member, as well as in conditions where people are not behaving in their own best interest, right? Self-harming and stuff like that. Probably in opposing dynamics, but in any case, neuronal junction box. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Junction was one of my words that I would use in basically every publication when I was writing, just because of the circuit that I studied. It was a junction, or is, I guess, a junction that you and I have. but yeah, I mean, it's just a cluster of neurons. That's all it means. Okay, so why do I find this research interesting? Apart from it being sort of in the same category of research that I did in graduate school, I have the feeling that this predisposition that we all have, right, to favor in-group members over out-group members as a function of some kind of largely arbitrary preference, right, is something that's been exploited in many ways to motivate people to behave in ways that cause just unnecessary suffering that redounds to the benefit of people who are largely uninvolved. And so I'm not suggesting that there are no substantive differences between us, right? But I'm just soapboxing here, but I think that at least sometimes those differences would be largely inconsequential if it weren't for certain entities that see an opportunity to like harvest personal benefit from amplifying the intense tension that, between people who see themselves as fighting against each other, or fighting against some kind of outgroup, right? And so obviously that can be totally innocuous, perhaps even healthy in some cases, like when it comes to sports rivalries, right? It's just fun. It's sort of like an outlet for those types of emotional experiences, or school rivalries, right? Same kind of thing. Or even like benign workplace rivalries, right? That aren't vitriolic, aren't like, mean or anything like that, but motivate people to try and quantify their performance and try and push the envelope of performance, right? You're trying to beat this other member of your workplace, not in a violent or vitriolic way, but just, your competition pushes your performance, right? Nothing wrong with that in my mind. But when it comes to, at least in my mind, when it comes to things like political or religious or cultural affiliations, and some person or entity or whatever is painting the other as dangerous or threatening or whatever, right? Sometimes it's genuinely substantive. But, and I'll step down from my obnoxious soapbox imminently, but I suspect that at least in some cases, those distinctions are being exaggerated to achieve certain outcomes that have nothing to do with the best interests of the people who are actually expressing that in-group, out-group behavior, or actually feeling the ramifications of the amplification of this in-group, out-group dynamic. And so I will leave you to imagine what kind of venues for this kind of friction I have in mind. But I fundamentally think that, while this was almost certainly an adaptive feature of our consciousness during our early evolution, as Homo sapiens, it's largely become a disadvantage at this point. So personally, I'm hoping that we can crawl out of this mire of misplaced in-group, out-group tension and try to make, more sort of objectively rational choices. Obviously pretty unlikely, given that there's literally a neural correlate for this predisposition, as this study identifies, but one can hope, right? So that's what I have for you today. If you dig this kind of conversation about neuroscience, consciousness, and so on, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and pressing all those helpful buttons wherever you're watching this. Otherwise, have a great week, and I'll see you next time. And so, okay, so then Sherry says, well, I'm not going to let a scientist down so I can be in his group. That's pretty good. That sounded pretty good. How very true. Oh, I'm glad you agree. True, tribal divisions run deep. Yeah, right. But I mean, they not in like that wasn't the case in every social moment, right, in human history. And I think that, it's just a vulnerability that can be exploited. And it can motivate people to do a lot of things. It can motivate people to spend money, right? A lot of money, maybe money that they don't even really have. Or it can be used to motivate people to, behave in ways that are irrational, that aren't necessarily in their best interests, right? I'm thinking like cults, for example. I went on this big jag of, trying to understand and learn about cults over time, because it's just fascinating to me. It's such abnormal psychology. And, listening to the stories of people who had been either born into a cult or had joined a cult and then escaped or just left, it's fascinating to me. And a cult is very much exploiting that in-group, out-group dynamic. And like, there are elements of this whole like in-group, out-group dynamic that are purposefully, intentionally cultivated, right? Like, for example, when a social group will begin to generate their own lingo that doesn't really make sense to people who aren't part of the group, right? I mean, humans do this naturally, and like disciplines do it, right? Neuroscience, notorious for doing it. Government does it all the time, right? With all these inscrutable initialisms and acronyms and so on. But sometimes they're useful. Like in neuroscience, they're ostensibly useful to like just get to the point more quickly and cut down on word count in journals. I think that's most of why. Like, so we call it the VTA rather than the ventral tegmental area. But, there's also just instances where, people just make up phrases to refer to something that, just inculcates you or at least identifies you, designates you as a member of this group. So you have some kind of special wisdom, some sort of special value. You are special. You belong. You have purpose, right? I don't know. I think it's a fascinating process, and it's a vulnerability that we have. Rats are always blowing things out of proportion. That's true. Oh, mice are the drama queens of the rodent world. And so Hugh, I really appreciate the award, man. Really appreciate it. And Sherry, I appreciate the award as well. Your support for Ian is appreciated at patreon.com/Anthropoid. Thank you so much, Cosmic Cross. That's very generous of you. All right, yeah. So that's what I got for you. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Have a great week. And if you dig this kind of thing, maybe you'll consider subscribing wherever you're watching. Otherwise, I will see you next week. See you, everybody.